Hi, I'm Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 26. I wasn't sure what this week's episode was going to be about. Then I came across an article in the Huffington Post Religion that piqued my interest. In the headline of the story, I noticed the name David Barton, and I knew I had seen it somewhere before. Then I read on a bit, and David Barton is an author who is a regular guest on the Glenn Beck show back when Beck still had a daily show at 5 Eastern on Fox News Channel. And often remember David Barton. He seemed like a nice enough guy, but he would try to put a spin on the religion of the founding fathers, trying to make them look more like conventional Christians than deists. Well, it turns out he had released a book called The Jefferson Lies, and I guess it was somewhat controversial because of possible factual errors, and it reached the point where his publisher actually halted sales of the book and has even gone as far to recall copies from retailers because of the acknowledgement of factual errors. I believe I also read that they even halted the sale of the ebook version, which I guess makes sense. If you're going to pull the physical copy, you might as well do the same with the digital version as well, given the prevalence of ebooks nowadays. So if you're a regular listener and you know something about me and my views on religion and politics, or even if you're a first time listener and you can obviously tell from the title of the podcast that I'm a non believer, you might be wondering, why was I in the habit of watching Glenn Beck? Well, as I've talked about on the show before, I consider myself politically independent, and I tend to swing back and forth between Fox and MSNBC. Although I have talked about this on this show too, that in the spirit of intellectual honesty, not just with you, the listener, but with myself, I think I probably do have stronger left leanings than even I was aware of. Evidenced by the fact that when I tend to watch MSNBC, I find myself nodding my head more, and when I'm watching Fox, I find myself shaking my head more. But I try to be fair, and I try to get my news from different sources. And I remember when Glenn Beck first got his show and he was moving the Fox from CNN, and I figured, what the heck, I'll give the guy a shot. And he seemed kind of funny, kind of entertaining. And I remember as the show went on, he seemed to become more and more over the top in his demeanor and his approach, and his views seemed to become increasingly more extreme. And they really reached the point where they were bordering on fringe, even conspiracy theory type of territory. And even some of the things he said were rather irresponsible. And I think he was on Fox and Friends, and I could probably do a whole show on Fox and Friends and what I think about them and how biased it is for a morning show. But he was on Fox and Friends, and he said that the president had a hatred of white people or something like that. And he said a bunch of irresponsible things. I remember thinking to myself on numerous occasions, this guy is so extreme that one or two things is going to happen. Either his popularity is just going to burn out and people are going to get sick of his act, or he's going to become a problem for Fox and eventually they're going to have to let him go. And that's basically what happened. He might claim that the decision was mutual, but I don't know. So David Barton is not only an author, but he's also an evangelical minister. And according to this HuffPost article, Barton, who was named one of Time magazine's top 25 evangelicals in 2005, is a popular Christian history writer and a favorite guest on Glenn Beck's show. Beck also wrote the book's introduction. And they're speaking in the present tense there, so they must be referencing Glenn Beck's radio show or his online show. And I'll read you the first paragraph of the article as well. Following widespread criticism from a diverse group of scholars, as well as the threat of a boycott by Cincinnati pastors and church leaders, publisher Thomas Nelson has decided to stop selling David Barton's The Jefferson Lies, exposing the myths you've always believed about Thomas Jefferson due to factual errors. And you might wonder, since this guy is a religious proponent, why were pastors and church leaders threatening to boycott? I guess that has to do with the fact that he kind of tried to sugarcoat Jefferson's role as a slave owner. Actually, the article says David Barton falsely claims that Thomas Jefferson was unable to free his slaves. Damon Lynch, pastor of New Jerusalem Baptist Church, said in a press release. In fact, Jefferson was allowed to free his slaves under Virginia law, but failed to do it. The Jefferson Lies minimizes Jefferson's racist views. So I guess that's why some church leaders are upset with him. It kind of whitewashes or softens the portrayal of Jefferson as a slave owner. I always thought it was kind of strange on Glenn Beck's show how, on the one hand, he was all about wrapping himself in the flag, God and America, and on the other hand, the two people he seemed to really put up on a pedestal were Jefferson and Thomas Paine. And other than the whole quote unquote slave thing, I think Jefferson was a very impressive and admirable guy too, in that as Americans we owe a lot to him. I just thought it was strange because Glenn Beck would constantly be talking about religion, and then like a lot of religious conservatives, he'd have to try to deal with the problem that people like Jefferson and Thomas Paine were deists. Some people might try to argue that Paine was an atheist, or even that Jefferson was an atheist, but I think in the spirit of intellectual honesty, it's more the case that they were deists. And so I think one of the ways Glenn Beck perhaps tried to solve that problem was by having people like Barton on. And I actually discussed the religion of the Founding Fathers briefly on perhaps one of the first episodes of the podcast. And we're now up to episode 26, so that was quite some time ago. In case you're not familiar with deism, it's the belief that there is a creator God, but he doesn't really get involved in the affairs of mortals. He kind of, almost like a divine clockmaker, he makes the world, starts it up, lets it go, and then takes a step back and lets things play out. And deists also tend to downplay the existence of, or the importance of, things like miracles and supernatural events. And I always found deism kind of fascinating because on the one hand, it does acknowledge a creator God, but on the other hand, it holds what some might find the strange belief that God went through the trouble of making everything, but then takes a hands-off approach. And I think in a way, in a weird way, it makes sense. It's kind of a logical attempt to explain things. on the one hand, this was before people knew about natural selection. So things like how life existed at all, how did complex beings come to be, or a question we're still wrestling with: how is it that anything exists? On the one hand, rational and reasonable people could explain that by saying, well, there must be a God. But on the other hand, the deist approach also helps explain why we don't see miracles, we don't see evidence of the supernatural, perhaps why bad things happen to good people, etc., because God doesn't get involved. I believe that deism came to prominence around the time of the Enlightenment, and I'll actually read a description of deism from Wikipedia. Deism is a religious philosophy which holds that reason and observation of the natural world, without the need of organized religion, can determine that the universe is the product of the Creator. According to deists, God never intervenes in human affairs or suspends the natural laws of the universe. Deists typically reject supernatural events such as prophecy and miracles, tending instead to assert that a god, or the supreme architect, does not alter the universe by intervening in it. This idea is also known as the clockwork universe theory, in which a god designs and builds the universe but steps aside to let it run on its own. So, yeah, that's basically what I just said. And a big example of Jefferson's deism is the existence of what's come to be known as the Jefferson Bible. It was also known by the title The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And it was literally Thomas Jefferson taking a razor to the Bible or different Bibles and copying and pasting the bits that he liked from the gospel writers, putting them in what he saw as chronological order, and basically excising the bits that had to do with the supernatural or miracles. So the Jefferson Bible starts off with the birth of Christ, but deletes anything about angels and immaculate conception. Although, in fairness to the religious, I guess it does at some point at least make passing references to things like Noah's Ark and the devil. And I'm reading this online as well. This is actually from Wikipedia entry about the Jefferson Bible. And it says, in a letter to his close friend William Short, Jefferson clarified, "It is not to be understood that I am with him, Jesus, in all his doctrines. I am a materialist. He takes the side of spiritualism. He preaches the efficacy of repentance towards forgiveness of sin. I require a counterpoise of good works to redeem it. Among the sayings and discourses imputed to him by his biographers, I find many passages of fine imagination, correct morality, and of the most lovely benevolence, and others, again, of so much ignorance, of so much absurdity, so much untruth and imposture, as to pronounce it impossible that such contradictions should have proceeded from the same being." And in keeping with the attitude of the deist that you don't need organized religion in order to believe in a creator, Jefferson actually said this, and here's another quote from the same article. Jefferson was firmly anti-clerical, saying that in every country and every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot. They have perverted the purest religion ever preached to man into mystery and jargon, unintelligible to all mankind, and therefore the safer for their purposes. And I guess Jefferson initially even supported restrictions that stopped members of the clergy from holding public office. But he ended up reversing himself, saying that they had the same rights as other citizens. And I don't know really what it infers, but supposedly there's some controversy over why Jefferson wrote the Jefferson Bible, and there may have been two versions. The first, speculated, may have been meant to impart the moral teachings of Jesus onto the Native Americans, but the second version was for himself. But either way, obviously he deemed it acceptable to literally take a razor to the Bible and excise all the supernatural bits, or most of them, at least those from the narrative of the life of Christ. So you would think if he was trying to proselytize to the Native Americans, that he would want them to know the miracle stories also, if he actually believed in them. And supposedly even terms like quote-unquote nature's God, which Jefferson used in the Declaration of Independence, are typical of deism. And I guess his deism went so far that, and this would explain why he excised the miracles from the nativity story in his version of the Bible, that he was opposed to the idea of the virgin birth and even Jesus's divinity in general. As this quote is from a letter he had sent to John Adams on April 11th, 1823. And the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being and his Father in the womb of a virgin will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. As that's a reference to the Greek myth, but they're using the Roman names of Athena being birthed from the head of Zeus, which had to be split with an axe in order to release her. The myths are weird, that's why I like them. The reason why I want to devote this episode to Jefferson and his deism, I just think it's really important that all of us keep a clear head and a certain objectivity when we view the founding fathers. I think all too many times fundamentalist people in this country not only want to wrap themselves in the flag, but they want to claim almost ownership of the founding fathers and claim that the founding fathers were as fundamentally religious as they are. And we should keep in mind that these were people with basically Enlightenment values, very smart and rational thinkers, and that many of them were deists. They, generally speaking, believed in a creator God. They believed that he was a good God. They believed that in the moral teachings of Jesus, but they didn't necessarily care all that much for organized religion or place that much emphasis on it. Perhaps in the case of, as evidence in the case of Jefferson, some were even suspicious of organized religion. I think Benjamin Franklin, he too was a deist, and some might try to argue he was an atheist. I believe he's a deist, and but he would espouse organized religion because he thought it would behoove the public good. But I think as Americans, or if you're listening overseas anywhere, we need to shine a light on the truth of history, and we can't let people usurp or distort the actual history of the founding fathers and even their religious views, no matter how uncomfortable they might make devout or fundamentalists feel. But anyway, I think I'll keep it short this week. And as always, if you enjoy the show, like us or subscribe on YouTube if you would. And you can also subscribe to the podcast through iTunes or Podbean. You can rate us on iTunes or Podbean. And as always, thanks for listening.